Welcome to the Real Estate Show on KMED. June 24th is our date. Pete Belcastro and Joe Brett, the real estate guys, with you here at KMED. We're both real estate brokers with John L. Scott in Southern Oregon, and we get together with you once a week here on KMED to talk about all sorts of real estate-related issues and topics. And it's interesting, Joe, is that this is like the last month of the fiscal year. So we actually started our show next week. We'll start year number 9.
Wow.
Can you believe that?
It just seems like you said 6. Just the last time you said
9.
that. Yeah.
9. And think about July of 2009, what the economy was like, what the real estate market was like in Jackson and Josephine. It was horrible when we started our show. It was terrible.
We talked about foreclosures and short sales dominating the market. And it was a really kind of a gloomy time that we were working our way through there. But look at the turnaround that we have since witnessed and seen things come back pretty nicely. And we've also, over those 9 years, brought some pretty brilliant people to the microphones to join us, which is one of the strengths of the program, as your producer has done a great job of, and we've done so again today.
We don't even talk about foreclosures and short sales hardly anymore. They make up less now than 5%.
I got asked to run searches for Eagle Point and East Medford, 5 foreclosures in each of those cities, and East Medford and the entire city of Eagle Point. Anyway, that was just about 3 weeks ago, and that was all that there were even on the market.
It's been pretty active still, that's for sure. The demand, people moving here, is obviously we know it. They come here for quality of life and some jobs and all sorts of things that people are still coming here. Well, Glenn Cunningham has joined us here today on KMED. Glenn comes in this time of year, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, I suppose, we've had Glenn join us here to talk about the other side of real estate in terms of finances and taxes and what do you buy something? What does it mean if you earn money and profits? And what do you do with? Can you shelter it? All these kinds of
what
things
are capital
relating
gains?
to things. And Glenn's got the answers for us. First of all, it's always good to have you, Glenn Cunningham. Welcome to KMED in our show.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. And I think this is the 4th year. Although I have to say, I think I need you to lower the bar in the future because I'm a little bit nervous now that you said such nice things about me.
Yeah. Well, they're all true, though. So what's since you were here a year ago, what's been the biggest thing kind of that you've seen in since you were here in, I guess, June of 2016?
When I was here last year, we were talking about a market that was strengthening, a market where there was more and more buyer demand and where sellers were getting increasingly higher prices on their properties.
Okay.
And last year, I remember you were optimistic that the increase in the market was going to encourage people to put their property on the market, and
that didn't work.
It hasn't worked quite as you predicted it, and as a result, the supply is not keeping up with demand, and supply and demand. Going back to when I was an economics major in college, if there's less supply and more demand, prices go up.
Yeah, well, that was economics 101, right?
And to Pete's defense, one of the reasons that sellers are not taking advantage of the return of equity in their homes and the increase, Jackson County's been up double digits the last 2 years overall for county property values. There's not a lot of places for people to move to. I think the people that want to sell their homes don't necessarily want to move out of the area, and there are not a lot of places to land right now. And Pete just mentioned we've seen our most listings in a month, this month, that we've seen in a year or so. I think slowly but surely people are gaining some confidence. We're building some new homes. But that's still, I think, a tricky piece of the puzzle unless you're moving out of the area. Where are you going to land here locally?
Well, I've lived in Ashland on and off since 1998, and the sign at the Ashland border always said there's about 20,000 people here. And that's 19 years ago, and there's still about 20,000 people in Ashland. And so the housing stock isn't increasing dramatically. Nope. There aren't a lot of places for people to buy in if they want to move in. So if you want to stay in the community, it's hard to extract the equity from a property.
And we've certainly seen equity improve, certainly all over the state. Last statistic we had, 96% of homeowners were above, had equity in their homes.
Well, that's different than 9 years ago, what we talked about.
No kidding. Well, anyway, 1031 exchanges. Gosh, I know a lot of our listeners, hear about these things, Glenn, and do a 1031 exchange, someone will tell you, and they look at you with kind of glazed eyes. So we're going to let you kind of start off with here with a 1031 exchange in real estate. I forget what year I knew this when these were allowed, when they first started this kind of thing. But tell people what they are, Glenn. We'll start it off with that.
I think it's really important in the context of your practice to say one very clear thing up front, and that is a 1031 exchange isn't an opportunity for somebody selling their primary residence.
Wait. Not an opportunity for someone selling their primary residence.
That's correct, because a 1031 exchange is specifically for what's called trade or business property. So that's a commercial rental or a residential rental, but it's not someone's primary residence because you don't own that property for trade or business purposes. You own it because it's your primary residence.
And there are benefits to having it that way, right? For your primary residence. There absolutely are benefits, and we probably don't have time to go into those today, although we have talked about those in the past. A 1031 exchange is one of the greatest tax deferral opportunities, but it is limited to trade or business property. So if you own a rental home, or you own a rental duplex or a triplex, or you own commercial property,
or several of those types of properties,
or
as
several
of
those properties, absolutely, Joe, a 1031 exchange may be an opportunity for you to defer the income tax on the unrealized gain on the property. Let's say that you purchased a property 15 years ago for $200,000, and due to the effects of supply and demand, that property is worth $500,000 now.
Okay.
You have a significant amount of unrealized gain in that property.
About $300,000, and you're roughly right in there. Okay, so what do I do with this? Okay, now I got to do something with it.
That's absolutely the math. So you have $300,000 in unrealized gain. If you sold that property in a straight sale, there would be tax implications of that $300,000 gain. If first, you're interested in deferring the tax on the gain, and second, interested in reinvesting the proceeds from that property into a new property, then a 1031 exchange might be the right kind of transaction for you. I'll give you an example. A client of mine used to own, his father owned a strip center in Ashland.
A shopping mall, not a strip joint we're talking about. Okay.
Yeah, a shopping mall, not a strip joint. Thank you for clarifying for me. Right. Let me know if I get into too much lingo. And when his father passed, he inherited that shopping center. And over time, that shopping center was worth more and more and more. So ended up being a property that he inherited with a value of a couple of $100,000 was worth $2.5 million.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
My client isn't interested in getting out of the real estate market. My client is interested in, when he leaves this earth and his wife leaves this earth, his children inherit that real property.
Okay.
Well, a 1031 exchange was a brilliant way for him to defer tax on that. He was able to take the proceeds from the sale of that shopping center, invest them in other real property, pay no tax on the gain, and give his daughters potentially a greatly appreciated asset that they can live off of after their parents leave this earth.
Because otherwise, you pay, what, 30%? On those gains
it depends. So, there's a lot of conversation now in Washington about what the tax rates are going to be in the context of the Affordable Care Act and also in the context of whether or not we're going to have capital gains tax. But in the United States today, federal capital gains tax can be anywhere from 15 to almost 24%. So that's a pretty big range. And Oregon doesn't have a capital gains tax per se. You pay ordinary income tax rates in Oregon. So that could be anywhere from about 9% to about 11%. So combined, it can be as low as a combined 25% or as high as a combined 35%.
That's a big chunk.
And
Now-
it is a big chunk of tax.
All right. Now, a lot of our listeners have rental properties. You know, we always talk about getting our own rental properties, right? With a lot of our have rental properties. Why would I want to do a 1031 exchange on a rental property? I have to just exchange it for another rental property, right? If I already have one, what's the value of me changing it or doing that,
I
right?
want to upgrade. I want a bigger unit. I want more units in my complex. I want to turn that property and the equity in it to a bigger property where I can rent more rooms.
So there are a number of advantages. One,
I should let Glenn answer the question.
No, Joe. This is
I'm
great.
setting you up.
Thanks for leading me down the path.
You've heard
I really
that before.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
One, you may be tired of owning that particular
property. Okay,
Right?
that makes sense.
So,
Okay.
say you own a rental house and you're tired of being a landlord.
Okay, yeah.
You may want to a landlord for a residential tenant.
Okay.
Say you want to have the cash flow benefits of being a landlord, but don't want to have to be worried about unclogging toilets at 2:00 in the morning.
Okay.
Well, one of your opportunities is to convert that property, to convert your investment from a residential rental to a commercial rental.
Maybe buy a commercial piece of property with that.
Right.
Okay.
Or buy something that would afford you what's called a triple net lease opportunity. A triple net lease is where basically the tenant pays the property taxes and the insurance and the utilities, and the owner gets the
rent check.
The rent check. So and you know, if you're doing a triple net lease with a franchisee from one of the big burger chains, chances are they're not going to be calling you at 2:00 in the morning to unclog the toilet.
Okay.
You're going to have a regular rental income from that franchisee with much lower personal responsibility.
And cleaner hands.
Absolutely. So you can convert your investment in real estate from something that's more hands-on to something that's less hands-on.
Okay. Tell our listeners, Glenn, by the way, we're with Glenn Cunningham from Nagel and Padilla today on the Real Estate Show talking about 1031 exchanges. All right. Now, I'm trying to think, what about, oh gosh, there's so many different parts of 1031 exchange that that are out there, and anyway.
What other reasons? Upgrading might be a reason someone would take a 1031 exchange for one property to reinvest in a higher end, or maybe a couple of units, to expand their portfolio.
And there are multi-asset exchanges, Joe. That's a great question. You could convert 2 or 3 properties into one larger property, so you're consolidating your investment. You could go the opposite way and sell one high-ticket property and buy multiple smaller value properties. Or if you feel like you've tapped out the growth potential of this market and want to buy in another market.
Good point, yeah.
Want to buy in a smaller market where the property hasn't appreciated quite as much as it has here. You were talking when we first began the show today about how bad things were in 2008, 2009 when this show began. Well, I had friends who owned property in Nevada, in Las Vegas in particular, which absolutely was devastated, but is just beginning to recover now. Yeah. Say that you want to move from a high tax jurisdiction like Oregon to a lower tax jurisdiction like Nevada.
You can buy something there.
Absolutely. So there's not limits on where you can buy, at least within the United States. You can't do a deferred exchange, a 1031 exchange for foreign property, but at the last time I checked, Nevada was still one of the United States.
What have you seen? I mean, what types of 1031 exchanges have you seen then? Can you tell us a few? What have they all been kind of rental properties being converted kind of thing, or where is there a pattern, or do you see it?
Recently, I have seen a lot of significant trade-up opportunities for tenants, for owners. So most of my clients are, in their late middle age to early retirement years, and as the children leave the nest, as they think about working less, they want to convert their investments from things that require a lot more work to things where they can be more of a clipping coupons mode instead of an unplugging toilets mode. Joe.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? I can see that. I can see that. Do you have to have, if you do an exchange, I always heard that you have to have the value of the property that you're exchanging with has to be higher than the one that you're leaving. Is that true?
Well, one of the primary reasons to do a 1031 exchange is you want to defer the tax on the gain.
Right.
So if you have unrealized gain in a transaction, if you invest in a property that's lower value, the target property is lower value than the property that you've relinquished, then part of that gain will be taxable.
You still have the gain to be taxed. Okay. Yeah.
Part of it.
Sure.
The
Okay,
part that you don't reinvest.
Okay.
Right. So there it doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition though. You could choose to defer part of the gain.
Yeah.
I'm hearing echoes of Glenn's new certification as a financial planner
Gain.
coming through in the conversation as well, which is additional knowledge our listeners can benefit from.
What's really fun is just have a gain, instead of a loss. I mean, I like that better. Anyway, we're with Glenn Cunningham on the Real Estate Show talking 1031 exchanges. We've got a break coming up. We're coming right back to KMD and the Real Estate Show right after this. The Real Estate Show continues here on KMED. June 24th is our date. Boy, the last weekend of the fiscal year, and July 4th coming up next week. Summer's here. Boy, a lot of activity going on, that's for sure. Hope you're having a good weekend, whatever you do. We're with Glenn Cunningham today from Nagel and Padilla. He's a CPA. We're talking about 1031 exchanges and when that might be something to consider, especially if you've got a big gain coming up on property that you own. It's interesting, all the different possibilities that can exist using a 1031 exchange. So Glenn comes in here once a year with us, and we get to pick his brain about kind of what topic that he likes. And this is the one this year, and it's a great one because, as you say, a lot of people have gains. A lot of things are improving, the economy, everything. So it might be an opportunity to use a 1031 exchange to improve your situation, right?
And people don't like paying tax.
Yeah.
So
no, they don't.
So the combination of higher tax rates, a strong seller's market, and increasing prices make 1031s something that individuals who own trade or business property should consider.
Now, I remember in the first segment you said about trading, how you trade. Okay, you're saying a lot of our listeners have rental properties, more than one, many of them. They could combine those and trade up, maybe get a fourplex, an eightplex, or a larger unit, something like that. And it could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be in our area, right, Glenn? It can be anywhere.
Anywhere within the United States.
Within the U.S. I mean, that's a big thing. Tell me about the business part of that, because you say people could take those again, rentals, and you could convert them on a 1031 to a business property and things like that.
Sure.
All right.
In order to do a 1031 exchange is a like-kind exchange. 1031 is the code section for the Internal Revenue Service. So a like-kind exchange means one kind of property for another kind of property. And so if it's rental property, it can go from residential rental property to commercial rental property.
Okay.
It could go from commercial rental property, which includes a building, to land, where you have a land rent instead of a building rent, or a combination of a land and building rent. So the property has to be like kind. So I couldn't go from 2 or 3 rentals to a cannabis farm out in Jackson County somewhere. Well, you would buy the cannabis farm, and you might choose to use that cannabis farm, that property for a cannabis farm. Okay. But the steps are a little bit more complex because if you're going from renting to people to actually using it yourself, it's a little bit more complex transaction.
More complex transaction to go through more just steps, I guess, to make it. But it's not impossible to do.
No, but generally it is it's limited to like-kind property.
Okay.
The classic example that I use is when you trade a car in.
Okay.
in a lot of ways, that's a like-kind exchange because you're trading in a commercial, a vehicle that you've used for commercial purposes to another vehicle. Also for business purposes. So the old vehicle has depreciated in value, and the new vehicle obviously will begin that process as soon as you drive it off the lot.
Yeah. Now, people who always say that, well, geez, I want to take my house. I want to do my permanent residence. But you're saying that you cannot do that. I mean, it's not your permanent residence that you can exchange for another like residence.
The like kind exchange rules are only for what are termed trade or business property.
Okay, so that's the
and so
difference.
there is a limit to it. There are ways to defer or exclude the gain on the sale of a principal residence. They're very different than the 1031 exchange. The 1031 exchange is a deferral. It doesn't go away. You're kicking the
tax can down the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With the personal residence, when you sell a personal residence, you're excluding gain from income. You don't have to recognize that gain. You never have to pay tax on it as long as you meet the requirements.
Okay.
With a like-kind exchange, you're deferring the gain.
Mm-hmm. What are the most common types then of 1031 exchanges that you see?
So the classic kind of example is the deferred exchange. Essentially, you have a property called the relinquished property that you want to sell. You sell that property, and then you begin the process of identifying the target properties, which there is a time limit for how much time you have to do that, and then exchange the proceeds from that relinquished property for the target property.
Mm-hmm.
Say you sell your commercial rental on June 1st. You have 45 days from June 1st to identify the properties that you're going to replace it with.
Mm-hmm.
And you have 180 days from the date of the sale of the relinquished property to close on the new property.
Mm-hmm.
So 1031 exchanges are not for the faint of heart. If selling real property is stressful for you, you have to think seriously about the potential complications of a 1031 exchange because they do add a lot of stress, particularly when it comes to the limits on the amount of time. So that's a classic deferred exchange.
Now, when you say you got 45 days, you identify, you make the statement, right? You declare that you're going to do a 1031 exchange so everybody knows it, right?
Well, you have to actually do it in writing.
In writing, right.
Yes,
right.
It absolutely needs to be in writing because that's an essential part of maintaining the deferral of the gain in the transaction.
All right. When does the clock start on that 45 days? When I declare it or after I have I have found a property that I want to make the offer on?
The clock starts ticking on the day you close on the relinquished property.
On the day you close on the relinquished property. So it could be a while to get there, and then you have 45 days after it closes. Okay, well that makes sense.
Yes.
It's easier to do. Okay.
You asked about other kinds of exchanges.
Yeah.
There's a reverse exchange
Reverse.
where you, of course, there's a reverse exchange where you buy the target property first, and then sell the relinquished property within a certain amount of time, and then the exchange is conducted.
That's the opposite of what
that is absolutely the opposite. It is allowed.
You ever see anybody do that?
Oh, sure.
Oh, they do. Okay.
You find something that you want before you complete the sale on the relinquished property.
In other words, you've already picked it out.
Yes,
what
absolutely.
I want to go to.
Yeah.
It really is a way to improve your position, right? I mean, it seems like listening to you, especially if I have a bunch of older properties that maybe I've owned for a considerable amount of time, I could bundle them all up together and go do something different and find something better along the way because I have a lot of equity probably built up in these that I have. It really is a great way to do it.
It is a very interesting way to change the nature of your investment.
Yeah,
as we discussed earlier, from residential rental to commercial rental. There's another kind of exchange that I think it's important that we talk about, and that's an improvement exchange.
Improvement, okay.
Sure. Say you sell a property for $1 million and you identify a property for $750,000. So that would mean that you had $250,000 in value from the relinquished property that wouldn't be eligible for deferral of gain.
Okay.
Well, you could do what's called an improvement exchange and take that $750,000 property and add a second garage, add an apartment above the garage, so that you are able to put $250,000 in improvements in the target property, even though you paid $750,000 for it. You put $250,000 in improvements. You're able to defer the gain on the whole $1 million by purchasing a property with potential, and being able to put improvements into it and increase the rental value of the target property.
How is it affected by the person who's the receiving of this? In other words, I've had people say, I had somebody who wanted to do a 1031 exchange with me. I have a property that they want. What about the seller at that point? How are they involved with that? But you got to hold that thought, Glenn, until the next segment, because we got a break coming up. That's a good question as well. There's so many different ways you can look at these things, and but one of them has got to make sense for you, at least as we go along here. 1031 exchanges. We're with Glenn Cunningham from Nagel and Padilla CPA in Ashland. We're coming right back to the Real Estate Show here on KMED right after this. Real Estate Show rolls on KMED, June 24th, our date. Pete Belcastro here with you. Don't forget, you can check out any of our past shows at realestateshoworegon.com, our website. Some terrific shows there from the last few months. Everything from tiny homes to affordable housing, well, you name it, alternative housing, market watch shows. Lots of good information for buyers and sellers out there at realestateshoworegon.com. Glenn Cunningham is with us here in our final segment today, talking about 1031 exchanges and how interesting they are, especially if you have eligible property that you can improve your position, increase your wealth. And this is certainly one way to do that, by kicking the tax can, kicking the taxes on those properties, your gains down the road. Well, one of the things, Glenn, I wanted to ask you was, what about the seller of a property? In other words, you're the buyer and I'm the seller, and you want to do a 1031 exchange with me on my property that I'm leaving. How does a transaction work like that?
Well, Pete, you're a realtor, and I know that you deal with the stress that sellers and buyers have in transactions. And I'm sure that's not your favorite part of the job.
Boy, it goes with it, doesn't it? It's an emotional thing.
It absolutely is. You're selling or buying one of the most expensive things that you will ever trade.
Absolutely.
So for most sellers, the 1031 exchange, in my opinion, isn't an economic factor so much as a stress factor, because the buyer is under that much more pressure to complete the transaction by a certain period of time.
They have a 45-day window.
Well, they have a 45-day window to identify the target property, and they have a 180-day window to close on the target property.
Okay.
So the time is limited.
Yeah.
And if you're 4 months into that 180-day period, then the buyer is that much more stressed about closing by the end of the 6 months. And if you don't close by the end of the 6 months, the gain
the tax becomes real.
Absolutely. The gain is what's called failed.
Okay.
So say that you're a seller who wants to buy another house. So you don't want to close on one rental property before you sell your current rental property. Well, that adds stress to it, because the seller of your target property may not be able to close within the time frame to allow the original buyer.
Have you ever seen that happen?
I have seen lots of things happen, and we don't really want to get into the gory details here.
But you've seen them fail.
I absolutely have seen them fail.
That's my question.
They fail for a lot of reasons, and one of them certainly is that there's contingencies on the target property that aren't able to be met by the time the deadline occurs.
And say I'm wanting to buy, say, a strip mall, as you talked about, from rentals, and there's a gain there. And the gain comes in there. I can use that. I don't. How did you say that? The gain. I can kick that can down the road. Can I get a loan on that property to go with me, or do I have to pay cash for any of this stuff, or is it a normal transaction done with that?
Well, lenders may be more willing to lend you money when you bring a big pile of cash to the table. So
because I'm bringing the gain that I've just made.
You absolutely are. And I know I've thrown big numbers around when we've been talking, but 1031 exchanges are complex and expensive, so they make more sense the larger the amount of gain that you're deferring.
Okay, sure.
Say that you have that property that you paid $250,000 for. Say that property is worth $1 million now, and you want to buy a $2 million property. Well, you're bringing $1 million to the table. A lender is probably going to be more likely to want to lend to you when you bring $1 million in equity to the purchase of that target property than if you bring a 20% down payment of $400,000.
Yeah.
So it may improve your chances of getting a good loan at a good rate when you bring more money or value to the table in that 1031 exchange.
And have you seen a bunch more coming your way, that more owners of properties are doing this right now, Glenn?
I absolutely have. I spend a lot of time with entities that are called exchange facilitators. Exchange facilitators are third parties who facilitate the 1031 exchange, because between the time you sell the relinquished property and you purchase the target property, you can't hold on to that money. That money needs to be rest someplace.
It's almost like escrow. You put it into escrow, kind of.
Absolutely.
Interesting. You have to do that. Yeah, okay. I didn't know that.
But you have, in when you're selling a piece of real property and buying a piece of real property, you really have two escrow transactions, and then you add the exchange facilitator to the mix. So you have
the third party,
right?
Okay.
Absolutely. And a 1031 exchange is not inexpensive. It adds a significant amount of cost to the transaction, but if you're planning on deferring the tax on a large gain, it makes sense to consider doing that.
But you're seeing that happen. I mean, it's what I guess is you're really seeing that now.
I am seeing more and more of it, and it is a natural part of a seller's market when prices are increasing, and especially if the seller invested in property after the crash in 2007, 2008, or well before the prices reached their peak prior to 2007, 2008. But if any of your listeners are considering 1031 exchanges, they should talk to their accountant.
Yes.
They should talk to a good exchange facilitator, and they should do some research on websites of exchange facilitators. Most of the major exchange facilitators have great websites with very detailed, frequently asked questions that can help you understand whether a 1031 exchange is right for your listeners.
I'm going to start with you and then you can go from there, because you're going to point me in the right direction. So I know people can get a hold of you at nagelandpadilla.com, right?
Nagelpadilla.com.
Nagelpadilla.com.
And they could follow us on Twitter or Facebook, and I have a LinkedIn profile. So there's lots of information on the great interweb.
And this last year, you achieved something really great. You got a designation. I just want you to tell people what you did, because you worked so hard on that, I know.
Thanks, Pete. It really was a lot of work. I became a certified financial planner in December of 2015. So on top of helping our clients with business advisory services, tax planning, and tax preparation, I'm also qualified to help them plan for retirement, plan for education, look at their insurance needs, look at their investment needs.
And as I guess the theme of today, a 1031 exchange is a possibility. check with Glenn, because improving your financial position is really what it's about in the real estate world. That'll do it for the show. Glenn, thanks for being here. We'll visit with you next week. Have a great week, everybody. God bless. We'll talk to you soon here in KMED.
You've been listening to The Real Estate Show on KMED Radio, presented by the Rogue Valley Association of Realtors, along with John L. Scott Real Estate of Southern Oregon and Bank 34 Mortgage. For guest contact information, download our free app, or to watch a past show, visit us online at realestateshowOregon.com. This show is produced by Table Rock Productions. Join us again next weekend for Southern Oregon's one and only Real Estate Show on KMED. And thank you for making the Real Estate Show part of your weekend.